Hello and welcome to another episode of Casting Views, the podcast that takes a topic each week and, as the name suggests, casts views. This week is a return of a guest whose voice hasn't been heard for far too long on this show, and I need to sort that out for the future. It's Antonio from The Cultworthy. I apologise for how long it's taken to get you back on here.
It's partially my fault too. Like we keep saying, "Hey, let's do this," and then I'm just terrible at getting back to you. So don't take all the blame, my friend. It's equally my fault.
No, you're too kind. So yeah, we've spoken. Well, obviously we speak all the time, and yeah, there's a few ideas. And I remember a little while ago floating a number of ideas past you, and I think this episode caught your eye a little bit more. So I'm keen to have your expert view on this subject. But generally, before we kick off, how's things going for you? Also want to say, Antonio, of Back to the Balcony podcast, which is one of my new faves as well. And that's not a new podcast anymore now, is it?
We're coming up on a year. Like,
Wow, is it?
I think we have 3 more episodes to record, and then it'll be exactly a year once we have all those released. So it goes by fast. Our first episode was January 2nd of 24, and we're almost there, man. Almost there.
And again, I know I've mentioned it before, or it's probably with Justin as part of when he's guested on here. Again, I love the idea of it. So you two take a film that's been reviewed by Siskel and Ebert, and you're kind of Siskel and Eberting Siskel and Ebert, aren't you?
I mean, it's interesting that we've kind of fit different dynamics over the year. So what I decided to do, because he loves Roger Ebert so much, is I would critique Gene Siskel's reviews on things and he would critique Roger Ebert's. But as we've been doing the show more and more, I realize why he likes Ebert so much is because Gene Siskel is so inconsistent and often I think has a very personal agenda in his critiques and his reviews, where Ebert's just a bit more of a contrarian, right? He really wants to get the best message out of the films that he's reviewing, even if he doesn't like them. Where Siskel is just like, no, this sucks, it's ugly, it's evil, it's all this. So it's hard for me to now like try and defend the guy, even when he has a good review. And I feel in this process, Justin and I have kind of worked our own personas into this, where we're no longer just talking about Siskel and Ebert. We're really talking about ourselves and how we look at cinema. Because as good of a friend as Justin is, we look at movies very differently. Even though we like agree on so many of them, we just look at different things about movies that we appreciate. And I think that's the biggest draw of the show now, is where I'm an appreciator and a defender of the effort, and he is a very non-biased reviewer and critic of films. Or he doesn't want you to waste your money or your time, and I'm on the end of, no, it's not a waste of money or a waste of time. See what this guy did. It's terrible, but see what he did, because it's fascinating why it's terrible. And I think that just makes for a much more interesting conversation than your classic thumbs up or thumbs down, you know?
I was actually going to say, I think that's what's brilliant about the two different types of podcasts you do in your, I was going to say day job, but you know what I mean, in your normal, your solo podcast. So then coming together, it's great. And you have disagreed on films as well, which is also interesting to hear that as well, rather than always two people necessarily agreeing.
I mean, I know this episode comes out a while from when we're recording it, but the next 3 or 4 that we have coming out, we definitely disagree on some things.
Ooh. I'll keep an eye out for that, because Justin can get quite salty, can't he? Sometimes in his views and takes.
He's gotten saltier on his show a lot more lately. I love the fact that he's no longer like editing the F words. Because before, like me, he was like, I want to make sure that my audience is a little bit more open. I don't want to offend anybody. And I kind of stopped that at the start of this year. And the last few episodes of The Movie Wire, he's just been so pissed off about these movies. He's like, I'm not censoring anything anymore. I'm going all out.
I had to message him one day, because I tend to listen to all your podcasts on my lunchtime walk at work.
Right.
Because I was listening, and it was where he did a little kind of like skit on, it was a film, I can't remember the name now, but it was like an AI film, something about that. And he was so angry, and he just let out the F word, the MF word, and I sort of stopped and had to double check, was I listening to the right podcast? And then messaged him and said it made me laugh so much. But yeah, so we'll keep an eye out on that. And what about The Cultworthy? So I know you had, we were talking a little bit beforehand, so you had kind of a little break, and now you're back with new season, and that's kicked off with some
Yeah.
great episodes already.
I waited 3 years to finally take a break and say that's the end of season 1, right? Because my original intention was, I'm not gonna do seasons. I'm not gonna do, oh, season 1 and season 2 being like 6 months or 6 weeks. I don't know. To each their own. I was just gonna keep on going. And then during the summertime, I just really needed a break, not necessarily from the podcast. I just needed a break to finally just have some fun with the kids and do some things that I didn't have to worry about anything else, like work and kids. Finally, like now that pandemic is over for the most part, we lost 2 years essentially of taking them out to do things, so I really just focused on the family, and in that time, I was still recording. I just wasn't editing and putting stuff out. So the bright side of that is now that I have the new season, which started, September 1st, I think, is when we started the new season. I had like 10 episodes in the bank, so I'm 10 episodes ahead, and I've never felt more relaxed and comfortable with the show. And I got some great guests, some really prolific podcasters, YouTubers, and my favorite so far is I got a very popular actress in the cult circles, Diane Franklin, on the show. I got to interview her about all of her movies in the 80s and 90s, and by far my favorite episode. And I was really proud of myself that I was able to have a great conversation with someone so prolific and not fanboy and freak out, right? I maintained my cool, and so now I feel more confident in talking to people that are a little bit more famous in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, so that episode came out, well, time recorded September, didn't it? I think you released that fairly early
It
on.
was like the last week of September, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a great listen. And yeah, like you said, I know how excited you were to get that, and it was a brilliant listen. So yeah, if you're listening, do go check that out. But more importantly, if you're not, and why wouldn't you be, make sure you sub to the Cult Worthy for that and Back to the Balcony. Two great shows. And Antonio, I can say that while you're here, just a superb person as well. So yeah,
Oh, thank you.
make sure you're supporting him and the podcast. So we are gonna. Well, I was gonna say we're gonna take a short break, but we're gonna still hear your voice because I'm gonna play a trailer for your show now. Anyway, here, so you sit back and listen to more of Antonio now.
The Cultworthy Podcast. Join me, Antonio Palacios, each week as I guide you through a never-ending sea of obscure cinema and cult-worthy gems that deserve a rediscovery. Find me on all listening platforms and at thecultworthy.com. The Cultworthy Podcast. Join us.
Right, we're back. So, as I said, we had a number of topics we could have discussed, and you picked films that have either been cancelled or were in development hell or a mixture of both. So I think mine fall more under the development hell side of things, which I was talking to someone and they said to me, oh, do films normally do that? Because we know video games often have that, they can take years to come out. But in my mind, there are definitely a few films that jumped straight away to me that have been in that protracted production and development period. So what is it about this subject that kind of appealed to you?
I mean, this is just part of the business. So there's on general an estimated between 30 and 40,000 scripts that are written each year and submitted to Hollywood. There's probably more that are written, but they don't get into the industry. And of all those scripts, maybe a couple hundred get produced per year. And theatrically or for streaming, it's a tough market and there's a very tight bottleneck for creators and for writers. And so just because a script gets through the system doesn't mean that it's going to get made anytime soon. Like there are scripts that are still being talked about and pitched and looking at the logistics of, can we make this a feature? Is it worth it? Is it worth the money? And if you listen to Justin's show, when he reviews films, it's like, how did this even get made? Who knew who? Who was sleeping with who? That really is a lot of the reality of the industry, where it's like sometimes a film that shouldn't even be made gets made because someone knows the right person or there's like just the right connections. And there's something called the Hollywood Blacklist, where every year they talk about amazing scripts that were, generating a lot of excitement, and then they don't get made and they just sit on the shelf. There's lots of scripts that was sat on the shelf for decades before they finally got made. And by the time they get made, they're no longer relevant for the decade or for the era. And so they have to make a bunch of adjustments. One of my favorite things about some of these scripts is some of these scripts are written in the 70s and 80s, and then they get made in the 2000s, and now they have to deal with the ideas of technology, cell phones and GPS and trackers and things like that, where the film no longer works unless it's updated, and then it just kills the whole theme of the story. So it's a interesting and tough market. So when I looked at this list of things to talk about, I'm like, you know what? There's some films that I really, really wanted to see, and some never made it into production, even though they sat in pre-production forever. And then, the technology, the time, the era, the budgets just didn't work, or the popularity of that genre just didn't work anymore. And it's a really fascinating thing, because at the end of the day, there's more films that weren't made than films that actually were, and we just don't really hear about it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating you say that because I was going to say, and obviously I'm doing most people disservice when I say this. I reckon for the normal cinema goer or film viewer, we see a 90-minute film, and that's what we see. We see, yeah, that perfectly edited, or most times perfectly edited film, 90 minutes. How much effort can it be? But I guess, yeah, you're not looking at the years and years of lead up time to that. And as you said, there is a number of reasons. I mean, I just sort of scribbled a few down that you normally hear, and creative differences is often a big one, right? You
Yeah.
often hear that people leaving because of that dreaded creative difference. Budgets, like you said, and especially, I guess, the longer a film's in development, the more expensive it's going to be, right? Scheduling conflicts, I mean, especially if you're trying to get main actors. I think we did an episode, didn't you, or last time you were on here with Caesar, and we talked about casting changes, didn't we? Because
Mhm.
often the actor that they wanted isn't available or signs up for something else in the meantime. Legal issues I've got, and even just a lack of interest or support. Yeah, because sometimes, as you said, the hype for a type of film or a sequel can just dissipate over time, right?
There's also another factor that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's speculative licensing. Very much like real estate. You got studios out there, you got producers that will purchase a license or a property on spec, and they have 5 to 7 years that they can hold on to that before they produce it. Some studios and some producers will actually buy these projects on spec if they find out someone is interested in making the project and they just don't want that studio to have it. So they will purchase the rights to these and just sit on them so no one else can make it. And they have no intention of making these movies. So there are, like, checkers not chess dynamics to the industry that a lot of people don't even think about, where it's like the studios literally trying to screw each other over from making something successful. And Warner Brothers is notorious for that, where they will hold on to a license with no intention of making it. They just don't want anyone else to make it. And so by the time those rights expire, the star is too old. The director's passed on it. The script is no longer relevant to the time. And that happens a lot. So there's lots of great films, a lot of them intellectual properties from comic books and video games and things like that, that will never get made the right way because studios are screwing around and sitting on these properties
It's incredible, isn't it, that they will spend millions on something just to not have somebody else make
just to
make it.
not have it
Yeah.
made. 100%. Yeah, it's a dirty game, man.
It's a proper, I was going to say, it's proper grown up playground antics, isn't it? Okay, so I asked you to come with a number of examples of ones that meant something to you. So let's hear your first example.
Yeah, let's kick it off. So, I've discussed this personality before on your show, and that's Anthony Bourdain. He's one of my, icons. I look up to this guy so much, not just in the realm of culinary, but also as an entertainer, as a writer, as an educator who left us way too soon and way too tragically. But if I had, someone that I put on the top pedestal of people I respected, Anthony Bourdain is one of them. I went to culinary school and became a chef because of Anthony Bourdain. In 1999, 2000, I was working at a Barnes and Noble, which is our bookstore that we have out here, and I read his hardcover version of Kitchen Confidential. And today, it's my favorite book still. It's my all-time favorite book. I read it every couple years. I've read it so many times. And so the popularity of this guy happened so quickly that he didn't even know what hit him. He wrote essentially an article for a New York magazine that got purchased by a larger magazine, And then they gave him a chunk of money to write it into a book. All this time, he's still working 12, 15-hour days at his restaurant in New York City. So fame came quickly to him. The book blew up, became so successful because no one really did an expose on the restaurant industry and what it takes to be a chef and what it takes to be essentially a pirate, because it's a really salty bunch of characters in that industry, especially back in the kitchens. That was such a draw for me, and I wanted to be a part of that world. So I quit the bookstore and working at the coffee shops I was working at, and I went to culinary school and started working in kitchens because I wanted to be like Anthony Bourdain. So in 2000, 2001, studios immediately swept up the rights to Kitchen Confidential with the idea of turning it into a film. The book had barely been out a year, and they were already talking about this. So, one of my favorite directors of all time, David Fincher, he was just finishing up Panic Room with Jodie Foster and Jared Leto and Forest Whitaker. He had just done, like a year or two earlier, Fight Club, which is now a cult classic, very controversial in its time, with Brad Pitt and Edward Norton. So the studio was going to make a Kitchen Confidential film, and they were going to title the film Seared. It was to star Brad Pitt, be written by David Koepp, who wrote Panic Room, and directed by David Fincher. And by all accounts, it was on the fast track to production. They had a script, they were already scouting locations, they were going to shoot it in the restaurant that Anthony Bourdain worked at. He was going to be an advisor on it. And then just something happened where all of a sudden they decided not to do it. They didn't want it to be as dark and as gritty and as expose as the book was. The studio wanted to make it kind of silly, wanted to make it funnier. They wanted it to be essentially a movie kind of like Clerks, right? They wanted it to be kind of tongue in cheek and funny and silly. And nobody involved in the project saw the movie that way. Like they wanted it to be darker and grittier and really kind of get into the grime of these kitchens in New York City. And so one by one, they started walking away from the project. First, it was David Fincher. He's like, hey, I'm not here to make a wacky comedy. I'm here to make a serious expose. Bourdain kind of stepped away from it. He's like, this is nothing like my book. And then, of course, Brad Pitt dropped out. And for a minute, they were thinking, okay, well, then we'll do it with someone else. And Benicio del Toro was in the running to play the Bourdain character. So they had a script, they had production, they had stuff ready to go, and it just got canceled. So instead, 20th Century Fox did what they always do. They took that wacky comedy concept and they turned it into a TV series called Kitchen Confidential. And a very young, relatively unknown Bradley Cooper was cast to play the Anthony Bourdain character. And in the series, they call him Jack Bourdain. They made 13 episodes of this show. And here's the thing, it's not that bad. It's actually kind of funny, and there's a lot of drama and intensity to it. I would say if you liked The Bear, which is on its like third or fourth season now, it was kind of a precursor to that. A little bit more comedy, not as serious, but it did have that kind of vibe. However, no one wanted that version of this story. They wanted, like David Fincher wanted, a darker, more realistic version. So they made 13 episodes, of which only 7 aired on TV, and then they canceled the show. And you can still watch these on YouTube. I think they put out a DVD set with all 13 episodes, but it kind of killed the whole cinematic version of this movie. And Bourdain was just like, okay, well, obviously this part of the industry is not for me. And he went to do his other shows, like his Cook's Tour and his No Reservations show, which, in my opinion, was the right move because it let him be the focal point, let him be the storyteller and the person that was going to expose all the culinary delights from around the world, and also the communities behind them. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the culture, the community, the environment. So I think it may be a good thing that that's what we got out of Anthony Bourdain's legacy and not like a half-assed movie that could have potentially killed whatever vibe he had going on, because if there's one thing we know about him, he was very prone to insecurities of the industry. Where if a movie came out and it didn't do what he liked, and if it made him look bad, he might not have continued with his career in the industry. So maybe it's a good thing, but goddamn, I still wanted to see that movie.
Yeah, and I know how much you do. Like you said, you kind of look up to him because you were on the first episode of what has now turned out to be Who's Coming to Dinner. So March 23, I think that was. So people go back to listen to that. The thing that strikes me about that story is, it's always amazing how a company can buy the rights to something and almost totally change the tone of what the source material is.
Mhm.
Like you said, to try and make some sort of wacky comedy when the source material isn't. It's like, why would you? I don't know. Maybe there's been probably tons of examples where that's worked, especially when it's sort of based on someone as kind of as grounded as Bourdain.
Mhm.
Why you would then turn it into something it isn't?
I mean, just to go to show the ignorance of Hollywood and the executives that run the industry. About 10, 15 years ago, there was a pitch to make a movie about Harriet Tubman, who is, an iconic African American figure in American history. And the studio head was like, "Well, can we make it with Julia Roberts?" And the people
Wow.
who were in the creative process were like, "What are you talking about? Harriet Tubman is an African American woman." The guy didn't know, but he was like, "No, we should make something like this for Harriet Tubman, being Julia Roberts. Can we mold it into a movie where she does the things that Harriet Tubman did, but it's Julia Roberts?" That's how ignorant these suits and these executives that run Hollywood are.
It's funny because we see parodies in shows like, I don't know, Family Guy, Simpsons, etc., about these thinking rooms in Hollywood and the decisions they come up with.
Right.
But it's probably not far from the truth, right?
It's not. No, it's not at all.
So, sort of one more question on this then is, so I know obviously he passed a number of years ago now, didn't he? Has there been anything since around him, or is there, could it be something they could adapt again in the future, or do you not think his legacy and the show he then went on to do is what his legacy is?
So they actually do have in production right now a biopic about him. There's not a lot out there. It's not entirely based on Kitchen Confidential. It's more of a actual life story leading up to the point where he passed away. But there's also a documentary that came out a year or two ago called Roadrunner that was very well made. It's a tiny bit biased because it intentionally avoids some of the more controversial things towards the end of his life, which I think is fine if you're trying to make a piece that is praising the dude. But a lot of complaints about the insincerity of the last half of that documentary. But it did spark a more interest. My personal gripe about the way he's been represented in the last few years is there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there who've kind of taken over the narrative of his life where people are trying to throw him into like the Me Too movement. Like there's lots of just nonsense in the conspiracy world. So if they do make this production about him, which like I said, it's in development right now and they actually have people cast for it, I really hope that they don't involve any of that nonsense because I really feel that that's kind of sullied his legacy a little bit, especially with people that don't know him as well as I do and other people who followed his career. There's lots of, Gen Zs and younger millennials that only know him from what conspiracy theorists have been talking about online. And I hate that. I hate that a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and before we move on very quickly, you mentioned The Bear. I'm weirdly just starting to watch that now. I'd love to know sort of thumbs up or thumbs down for you on that show.
In authenticity, thumbs up. I loved the first 2 seasons. Season 3 is kind of hit and miss for everybody, but I'll tell you right now, like, I've spent 15 years in kitchens like that. I was a professional chef. They're not wrong. That's what it is. The intensity is not over dramatized. Uh, there are, of course, things that are made for TV and a little bit more, fantastical, but the pressure, the stress, the having nightmares of the order tickets coming in and not getting finished, that's a very real thing. So yeah, I like the show a lot. I just feel that it's starting to get a little too artistic and getting further away from what its original intent was, and maybe they'll fix that in the next season. But I like it. I'm a fan.
Cool. I'm just on season 2 as of today, so yeah, enjoying it so far. As I said, mine are going to be short, sort of short snippets, and it'd be interesting to hear your view on some of these. So, for me, if I was to think of one, the first one that would always come to mind for me would be Deadpool. I know now I was going to say it's a flourishing trilogy of films, and who knows where the character's going to go in the future in terms of the MCU, because I think now he's actually part of the MCU. But I think it took Ryan Reynolds well over a decade to get the first film made, wasn't it? So I think it was, I've got here, so it was in 2000, Artisan Entertainment worked to deal with Marvel to produce and distribute a film based on Deadpool. 4 years later, still not made, and New Line Cinema then attempted to produce a film with David Goyer, working on the spin off with Ryan Reynolds in the role. Now, I think Ryan was it was X-Men Origins, wasn't it? Wolverine, where he played a version of Deadpool, which was, by all accounts, a pretty dreadful version of the character, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was nothing like the character. If anything, his role in Blade Trinity was more like Deadpool than the
Yeah, yeah,
Deadpool in
yeah.
Wolverine was.
Yeah, and it almost felt like that version in Wolverine was an attempt to kill off potentially the chance of a film. That's how it felt when you're looking back at it now.
Yeah.
In 2005, so this is 5 years after the original attempt or workings, New Line put Deadpool in turnaround, and 20th Century Fox became interested in moving the project on. Then, I mean, we're then jumping down. There's a number of people then were attached to the project, writers in and out. And I think in January 2010, we had more writers, and Robert Rodriguez was sent an early draft of the screenplay. And after negotiations with Rodriguez fell through, Adam Berg emerged as top contender to direct. We then moved to 2011 when Tim Miller was hired as director, making the film in his directorial debut. And in September 2014, Fox finally gave the film a release date of February 2016. So when it came out, it was the ninth highest grossing film of the year. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, we're looking at a film there 16 years in development. And I think if you listen to Ryan Reynolds now, you can tell there was somebody who really believed in that project and really wanted that film made, wasn't it? And it's great to, I mean, whatever your view of the films, and I'm not talking necessarily about you, but anyone listening, whatever your view of the films are, I think it's great to finally see someone being able to realize that ambition.
Well, because it really is just perfect for his personality.
Yeah.
Ryan Reynolds, up until Deadpool, was like a hit and miss for me because I've always liked the guy. I've always compared him to a modern day Chevy Chase in the sense of like his
Yeah.
dry delivery, but also comedic. But also the dude's good looking and he's ripped, right? So people knew they had a star on their hands, but it was just really hard to figure out what kind of project to put him in. Green Lantern was terrible. He was so terrible for that, and he agrees. He 100%
Yeah.
agrees, right? That's one of the things I like about the dude is like he does have a humility of like, yeah, I was not right for that, but hey, I just wanted to keep in the industry so I could get this Deadpool movie made. One of the coolest things is I think it was 2011 or 2012 before they actually really finalized whether or not they were going to let Tim Miller direct it. He put out, I think it was like a 6 or 7 minute CGI animatic, which is like a animated storyboard, which is essentially the opening scene of Deadpool, where he's on the bridge and he's drawing the little picture of Francis and Cran, then he jumps into the cars, and we have that awesome opening action sequence. That was made with CG 5 or 6 years before it was released. And it was essentially what got that project greenlit. He's like, okay, this is the vibe, this is the tone. Ryan Reynolds came in and voiced it. And it's almost scene for scene, that opening sequence. And it just goes to show like sometimes these suits just need to see what it looks like before they'll sign off on it. And that's what it was. It's like, this is what the guy sounds like. This is what the movie will look like. It is not a Green Lantern situation. It is not a dark and broody Batman situation. This is going to be a mouthy, fourth wall breaking character that works great in comic books. And this is how we're going to show you that it can work cinematically. And like you said, 3 movies in, highest grossing R-rated movies. And we were scared that Disney wasn't going to let them be nasty once they took over Fox. And I think Deadpool Wolverine kind of proved that they knew what people wanted and they actually listened for once.
Yeah, it does make you wonder what it would have been like if it was made 13 year or 16 years prior, whether it would be the same film, especially now. It feels like it's a perfect antidote to the regular MCU, right? And I'm not saying that to disparage the MCU, but I'm saying it feels like a bit of a breath of fresh air right now. Maybe 4 films in or 3 films in, that is starting to feel samey, but yeah, you wonder before the MCU really took off what kind of film it might have been.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Okay, over to you for your next one.
Okay, so this one, a little bit more obscure for people who aren't in the horror sci-fi realms like I am. So Guillermo Del Toro is one of my favorite directors. He's just an amazing visualist and storyteller. But the dude is also known for having a lot of projects that got left unmade. So just to make people, re-familiar, he did Nightmare Alley. He did his recent Pinocchio. Probably most known for Pan's Labyrinth, which is the one that really kind of exploded internationally, where everyone kind of recognized what this guy could do in the realms of fantasy and horror. So he was originally supposed to do The Hobbit after the Lord of the Rings films came out, and he was essentially ready to go. But at the end of the day, he backed out, wanted to work on other projects because he knew how daunting it would be. And Peter Jackson took over and gave us three pretty miserable Hobbit movies. So I'm not saying that Del Toro could have made them better. They just are different and they seem kind of lazy and lackadaisical. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. So since the early 2000s, he wanted to make a film version that's been called impossible to film of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. So At the Mountains of Madness really kind of focuses on what H.P. Lovecraft called the old ones. The people that lived here, not even people, the entities that lived on the planet Earth in the universe long before man existed. I think one of the interesting movies that kind of plays on this is Cabin in the Woods. Not to give spoilers away, but the premise of that is that there are ancient ones that existed on the planet before we did, and our goal is to please them. And that is, a very Lovecraftian thing. So, At the Mountains of Madness essentially is about a bunch of people exploring the Antarctic. And while doing so, they uncover an ancient city full of these ancient entities that kind of give clue to the creation of man and what our purpose is. And it turns into a very metaphysical and esoteric horror film with body horror, with lots of disturbing creatures and visuals. It's an amazing story. Del Toro was on board with this. He had been trying to make it for years, and the biggest argument from the studio was they did not want it to be R. They did not want it to be violent and gory and disturbing as the story was. They really wanted it to be PG-13 because the people that were interested in starring it, people like Tom Cruise, people like Brad Pitt, they wanted to capitalize on how much audience they could get into the theater to see an obscure H.P. Lovecraft story. And he just kept pushing back. He's like, no, no, no. This has to be frightening. This has to be bloody and gory. You know what I do. You've seen Pan's Labyrinth. You've seen all the films I put out that are disturbing visually and viscerally. And they just kept pushing back. Finally, they got a green light because just like with Deadpool, he released some CG animatics of what the creatures would look like, what the action scenes would look like, what the environment would look like, and they were stunning. And they're available on YouTube. You can watch them. But there's a problem because 20th Century Fox was currently developing another film by a much more powerful director with a lot more, let's say, hype around it and an already built in franchise. And that was Ridley Scott's Prometheus. And Ridley Scott's Prometheus essentially is about what they call engineers, ancient ones that are responsible for seeding our planet, creating us and our species and our race, and then humans going back to the planet of origin to find out where we came from and essentially seeing their facility of creation and unlocking a mysterious substance that will make or break us physiologically and biologically. It was just way too similar and obviously borrowed a lot from the original story. And so so Del Toro was just like, okay, I can't make my movie now because this essentially took all the best plot points of At the Mountains of Madness and have turned it into this weird proto sequel to the Alien franchise. Now, Prometheus did okay financially, but it had a lot of its detractors, me being one of them. I did not think it was a good movie. I think it was well made, but it's not a good movie. But the idea is just too similar to this story. And so if he would have made this film, it would have come out within a year of Prometheus. And he was wise. He knew that it was not going to avoid the comparisons. And for people who are just not in the know or not as well researched about the development and the story, well, they would just think it was a blatant ripoff of Prometheus. And so he wisely chose to not do it. Although there are some speculations and rumors that he might still do it as a streaming series in the future, but he wants to give it enough time to be separated from Prometheus. And we're over a decade now, so it could be. But I'm telling you, man, like I've been a Lovecraft fan for decades. I love that story. And I remember reading the synopsis for Prometheus 4 or 5 years before it came out. And I was like, this feels very much like At the Mountains of Madness. I sure hope that this doesn't screw Guillermo del Toro's vision of it. And it did. And I think we were at a loss for that movie not getting made.
Yeah, that feels such a shame, doesn't it? Because it's just bad timing rather than everything else we said. And I was going to ask you if you think he would do it or if he doesn't want to be put with any potential plagiarism or copying kind of thing. But like you said, if it goes to streaming, that might, as in a show, it probably feel enough distance and different format, right?
Yeah. I mean, and being very forthcoming of, hey, this is a HP Lovecraft original. And I think a lot more of the younger generations now are in tune with who HP Lovecraft is. You know, they had a Lovecraft Country show on HBO Max that was very popular. We are seeing a lot of pop culture references now to Cthulhu and all the different HP Lovecraftian creatures and myths and lore. So, I mean, even in video games, we're seeing a lot of
Yeah,
Lovecraftian horror.
yeah.
So, I think now would be a better time for it than it was then because we didn't have so much of those references in the zeitgeist, and now we do. And now that the Alien franchise is really kind of taking a separate direction from Prometheus, that you can tell they're going try to go back to the original ideas that the Alien franchise started off with. It might be well enough removed in the zeitgeist to move forward with it.
And all I've got in my mind as well is what would a Del Toro made Hobbit have looked like?
For all intents and purposes, it would have been a lot scarier, a lot
Yeah,
creepier.
yeah.
I've seen concept art for what he wanted the goblin world to look like, and it was crazy scary. So maybe it was a little too scary because at the end of the day, Peter Jackson, he does make disturbing visuals in those movies, but there's also kind of like a cheeky campiness to it and humor, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I think Del Toro would have gone full out horror with it.
A remake soon, who knows?
Who knows?
I've got a very short one here now, but on something that again, if I was to think about sort of development hells and potentially cancelled film, it was classic one, Superman Lives, and obviously Nicolas Cage. I think the project for that began in '93 by producer John Peters, so it was envisaged as a new film called Superman Reborn. The film was going to follow the storyline of the death of Superman from the comics. Jonathan Lemkin was hired to write the initial script, but Peters brought on a series of screenwriters to overhaul the script, including one Kevin Smith in '96. So 3 years later, still being overhauled. Tim Burton became attached with the film, and this is where Nicolas Cage starts coming in, who was going to be cast as the Man of Steel. But there were several more screenwriters for several more rewrites made. 5 years later, '98, Burton backed out, initially citing what we said earlier, creative
Creative
differences.
differences.
Yeah, with producer Peters and the studios, and instead went on to do Sleepy Hollow. So more writers and directors were attached over the next few years, and it would then continue to be rewritten and overhauled before it became Superman Returns in 2006. So 13 years after it initially began its life. Now, what I wasn't aware of, in 2015, there was a documentary called The Death of Superman Lives: What Happened. So I actually feel like I want to go find that out now because, a documentary on something we're talking about sounds great.
It's great.
Oh,
It is
really?
absolutely great. And, for years on YouTube, there have been little leaks and snippets of Nicolas Cage in the Superman costume. And to give you a time frame, he has his long hair because he was working on Con Air at the time. So while he was doing his Con Air filming, he'd be at the studio doing costumes, and the suit they have him wearing is crazy. It's got like neon lights on it, and it's really weird. Tim Burton was going places with it. But yeah, it's a great documentary. But what I suggest is you got to go back to there was a special that Kevin Smith did called An Evening with Kevin Smith. And this is early mid 2000s, where essentially he still does it to these days. They're essentially one man shows, spoken word kind of shows where he talks about his time in Hollywood and all these crazy stories about meeting Prince and meeting all these different people, getting hired to do these movies that never got made. But his story about being brought on to Superman Lives by John Peters is one of the most hilarious stories of all time, where he's still pretty new to Hollywood. He wrote his little draft, gave to John Peters, and then went to John Peters' house. And John Peters essentially told him all the things that he wanted in the Superman movie. And I don't want to ruin the whole thing, but his set of rules were he didn't want Superman to fly, and he didn't want Superman to have a cape. He also wanted the end to have a giant robotic spider. And the whole time, like, Kevin Smith is wondering, how am I going to write a Superman movie where he doesn't fly and he
Yeah.
doesn't have a cape? Like, this is Superman, right? And the film didn't get made. And the punchline of that is in, I think, 99 or 2000, the movie Wild Wild West came out, which John Peters produced. And at the end, they fight a giant robot spider
Yes, yeah,
because
yeah.
he didn't make a Superman movie, but he wanted his goddamn spider, so he put it in that movie instead. And it makes no sense. And it just kind of goes to, like, again, people in power in Hollywood do not understand the source material. They just get ideas and they spew them out there. And it's one of the reasons why we get such disconnected and incoherent adaptations of intellectual properties that fans love, and they're like, "What is this?" And that's a perfect example of that. I can't think of a better one than the Superman Lives debacle.
It's a determined man again to get his robotic spider eventually. Doesn't matter what film he's going to stick in.
Right? Sense and
And
Sensibility. We need a robot spider at the end.
yeah. And if I'm right, I think in the recent Flash film, isn't there a CG mock-up of Nicolas Cage as well? I think as Superman in that, isn't it? So they've riffed on that too.
Yeah, now that we live in the world of multiverses, yeah,
Yeah,
and we have Christopher Reeve in there. Yeah, we got all that stuff.
yeah, yeah. Right, over to you.
Okay, so my last one isn't necessarily one single film. It is an amalgamation, so to speak, of unrealized Quentin Tarantino projects. Now, obviously, I'm a huge Quentin Tarantino fan, but I try not to be too much of my podcast because there's enough Tarantino podcasts out there that do a lot better job than me of, dissecting the dude's career and his intellectual properties. But I've been following his career since 1993, easily. I had all the Entertainment Weekly, which is our US magazine that was, before IMDb and the internet would give us entertainment news and what's coming and what's in the pipeline. And he had so many projects where he announced that he was working on them. Didn't mean they were going to get made. He was working on them. So the fact is, we'll never see these because he's said that he's going to only do 10 films, which he already canceled his 10th film, which was called The Movie Critic, because he decided he didn't want to do it anymore. He wants to do something different. So I'm going to kind of give a quick list of films that he had in the pipeline. Some were written, some were actually just spec scripts, but we'll blow through these really fast. So, number one, in the early 1990s, he wanted to do a true to form adaptation of First Blood, the Sylvester Stallone movie where he plays John Rambo. It's very different from the one that we got in the early 80s. That was very different from the book. In the book, he's more of like a psychopath. and it's almost like a slasher film. And he wanted to do an adaptation of that, where Rambo is a maniac, not this empathetic, veteran character. He had a lot of people interested. He thought that Kurt Russell could play the sheriff. He was even thinking that later on, if he wanted to do it as a series, he could have Adam Driver play Rambo. It's just one of the things that he has been touting for years, but I don't think will ever be fully realized. Another one is he wanted to do The Man from Uncle, which Guy Ritchie ended up doing. And he was a huge fan of the old series. He wanted to do it more true to the series with a little bit more camp and not so, I don't know, serious and kind of a gritty as The Man from Uncle that Guy Ritchie did, which is still a good movie. But he never finished that one. He wanted to do a unofficial sequel to Inglorious Bastards called Killer Crow, and apparently he actually wrote the script for this one, and it was going to be Inglorious Bastards, but a team of African American GIs. So Brad Pitt would be in the film and essentially pass the baton to a group of African American soldiers that he wanted Jamie Foxx, Samuel L. Jackson, all these guys to be a part of and exist in that same universe. That script exists. Parts of it have been leaked online, but never fully realized, and I don't think we'll ever see it. This one is my favorite. This one has been out since day one, and that is the Vega Brothers. So, right after Pulp Fiction came out, we started seeing that there was a connected universe in Tarantino's movies. Reservoir Dogs had Michael Madsen as Vic Vega, and Pulp Fiction had John Travolta as Vincent Vega. We were to assume that they were brothers, and he wanted to make a prequel film that explored their life in crime, their antics in this, criminal underworld, and I think that would have been an amazing film. And he kept wanting to do it, but Travolta kept getting more famous. Tarantino kept getting more famous and making these other projects. By the time he actually wanted to do this thing, everyone had aged out. And he didn't want to go back and cast them younger because the whole idea was that when Tarantino writes, he writes his dialogue based on the cadence of the people that played these roles. So it was either Madsen and Travolta or nothing. And he can't go back and make it now because those characters, spoilers, are dead in this universe. But also, it's not the same. So, two of my favorite characters in the Tarantino universe had a movie. The script was finished. He said that he would maybe release it as a novelization because now that he's almost done making movies, he's going to be doing plays and TV series and novelizations. So, I would love to see that. And then finally, I think the one that we really are gonna miss out on is Kill Bill Volume 3. He's been teasing it for years. He's like, "Okay, Kill Bill now, believe it or not, Dan, is 20 years old."
Wow, 20 years. Wow.
So that means that the 2 little girls in that film would be in their mid-20s right now.
Yeah.
And he always wanted to do a conclusion to Kill Bill where now we're going to have Vernita Green's little daughter take vengeance on Uma Thurman, and her daughter Bibi is going to protect her. It's been speculated that he might make this his last movie now that he has canceled the one that he announced last year. If that is the case, I'm going to say that's icing on the cake. He could never write or produce or direct anything ever again, and it'll be a full circle of closing out the Tarantino universe. So it's been in talks for a long time. It's not confirmed that he'll do it, but he's been dropping a lot of hints, bro, about this. So us in the Tarantino fandom are really, really crossing our fingers that he makes the Kill Bill Volume 3 his last movie. And that's my list.
I love listening to all that. So thank you. I mean, if it was to be bookended by or to be completed by that, that would be a great, as you said, end to his movie career anyway. But I was going to ask you, do you think that these films will never be made? Do you think, okay, maybe not by him, but do you think the license, or is it that, as you said, his vision, he writes them for characters or actors, sorry, do you think that they will never be touched?
I don't think they'll be touched because he has never really been fully happy with any of the scripts that he has written that were ended up directed by other directors. So his script for True Romance that Tony Scott directed, I think it was in 92 or 93, is literally the only one that he is actually fond of and proud of the experience. The other scripts that he sold that were made by the directors, he's not a fan of, especially Natural Born Killers. Like he hates Oliver Stone's rendition of it. He essentially took his name off of the writing credits. He just has a story by credit. So it's possible that we might get a series. He also loves comic books. He's been talking about making comic book versions of these continuations of these stories. I just don't think we're going to see anything cinematically anymore from these prospects. I think if we do see them, it's going to be in another form of media, which I'm fine with. I think it's really interesting. And he's daring and he's got the money and the time and the clout to do that. I mean, he wants to do stage versions of Reservoir Dogs and The Hateful Eight, like on the stage, like on Broadway. That's cool. Like no one's really done that before. Not musicals, just live action serious plays. And a lot of his stuff is written to be, I mean, it's so dialogue driven that you can do that.
Okay, I'll just quickly type something down because while you've been talking, I've thought of a couple of other episode ideas that I'd love to get you back for, and I'm going to throw them at you at the end of this.
Nice.
And so, thank you again for all that. My final one was one I didn't know about, and when I read about it, I was kind of taken aback a bit about it. Were you aware about a sequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit? That was kind of.
Yes.
Oh, you were aware of this. So if I read correctly, I think there is something that's come out this year or is to come out this year, but this isn't what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about direct follow up to the original film. So this we're going all the way back to 1989, where J.J. Abrams, which I found an unusual one to be attached to this, but J.J. Abrams wrote a script for the sequel, but it was abandoned. Then we had Nat Mauldin wrote a prequel titled Roger Rabbit, The Toon Platoon, later to be renamed as Who Discovered Roger Rabbit. And this would feature characters from the golden age of American animation. And it would have had Roger living on a farm during his early days and traveling to the West to seek his mother. He meets Jessica, who just happens to be his future wife, and Roger was also going to be in the army. And this is a bit I found sort of amazing about the plot for this. So he was going to be in the army, and then Jessica was going to be kidnapped to do pro-Nazi Germany broadcasts, and thus Roger and a new character goes on a quest to save her, and that then being accompanied by several other cartoons in their army. It would also be revealed that Roger would reunite with his mum as well as his dad, Bugs Bunny, and it was cancelled because just as soon as Steven Spielberg saw the script, he left due to not wanting to satirize Nazis after having just directed Schindler's List. So again, we're looking at a timing thing there. Had it been earlier, who knows? But eventually it was reworked into a different story. Roger would have found himself in rising stardom on Broadway and Hollywood while still searching for his mother. Test footage was made, which consisted of CGI, traditional animation, and live action, which didn't please Disney. And a second test entirely made the toon CGI, but the film was scrapped due to budget reasons. And then at this point, there were doubts that a sequel would ever be made due to the rise of computer animation.
Mhm.
In 29, another attempt was made, but the human characters would have been done through motion capture, like the Polar Express. It was cancelled eventually due to Bob Hoskins' retirement from acting in 2012 and then eventually his death later on. And in 2013, it was announced that an animated Disney buddy comedy film starring Mickey Mouse and Roger called The Stooge would have been made, which was based on a 1952 film of the same name, and would have again have been a prequel. And in 2016, Zemeckis said that the sequel moves the story of Roger and Jessica into the next few years, thus moving on from film noir to the world of the 50s. It would have featured a digital Bob Hoskins due to Eddie being depicted as a ghost in the film. And in 2018, Zemeckis claims that Disney is unlikely to ever make the sequel. As I said, I think there's a short animated film come out this year or is going to come out. Yeah, what's your take on that? Because some of the stories as well, especially the bit about Germany and Spielberg, I found that to be the really interesting part of the evolution of this non-film.
Yeah, I mean, that again, this is a sequel that people have talked about for years. We've seen little bits and pieces. Essentially, from what I remember correctly, is that late 80s, early 90s pitch. Spielberg canceled it because he was literally doing Jurassic Park and Schindler's List at the same time. And he knew how ambitious the project was going to be. But also, man, like I really think that Roger Rabbit was just a thing of its time. You know, it is such a 80s movie, and there are things that just only belong in the decade that they came out in. And I think people kind of agree with that now when we start seeing some of these legacy sequels not do well at the box office because people who loved them at that age have grown out of them, and then the newer generations don't understand them. You know, Roger Rabbit is more popular among Gen Xers and older millennials because we grew up with it. And there was just too much amazing animated cinema that came out in the 90s and 2000s that kind of overpowered it. You know, Toy Story overpowers Roger Rabbit. It's a franchise, it's a licensing mecca, and Pixar really kind of took over. Pixar and there are some other studios like Illumination and DreamWorks that have these really iconic franchises like Shrek and Toy Story and Finding Nemo and all stuff like that. Bringing back something that's kind of nostalgia baity doesn't make a lot of sense financially because you know how expensive it's going to be. The whole idea of Roger Rabbit being so appealing in the 80s is that you had Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse and all these different studios and licenses together in one movie, and the movie's huge. The idea of making a sequel, you can just imagine how expensive it's going to be because now everyone's going to ask for more money for those licenses. So I think if anything, that's the downside. If you try and make a Roger Rabbit sequel with just Roger and not all the iconic characters we saw in the first one, essentially it's like a Marvel and DC made a movie together, right? It's that kind of thing. It's just too much money with not enough guarantee of return to ever see it. So if they're gonna make more Roger stuff, keep it in the short form. Like make the little cartoon shorts like they're doing, like they did. I mean, they made Roger Rabbit cartoons for 10 years after Roger Rabbit came out, and they'd put them as like little shorts before
Yeah.
movies started in the theater. And they were great. They were a lot of fun. But in my opinion, I think that is the future of Roger Rabbit. If there is a resurgence, it needs to be in short form. I would really hate to see a studio essentially bankrupt itself by trying to make a sequel that there might not be a lot of audience for, and then put all their money into all these licenses and then it just crash, And Disney, I think, knows this because they've seen a lot of their MCU stuff kind of fizzle lately. So it's kind of time to go back to the drawing board.
Well, and we're coming up. Well, in 4 years, it's going to be 40 years, right, since the original film. So
Oh my
that's
god, I saw it in the theater.
well, there you go. Yeah, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, 1988. So yeah, that's some passing of time there. So okay, look, I could literally listen to you talk about movies and history of movies all day, but I think we're going to have to end it there. I'm definitely getting you back, so I want to get you back for a mind wipe anyway, because I think, yeah, I really want to get into your mind about some of the subjects we talk about that. But it was funny. I was thinking as you were talking. One is I would love to throw a scenario at you where you could pick some films and put different directors in, or rework those films with different directors. Also, I know you said that there are other podcasts that delve into Tarantino, but I would love when his final film releases is maybe to get you on for a casting V special where I grill you then about your view of his 10 movies and his history. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah, we might have to wait a while.
Well, you'll be on before then anyway. Look, thank you very much for coming on and being a part of this. Please give people your elevator pitch about where they can hear you and more of what's coming up.
All right. So, my main show, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast, every Thursday. You can follow me on all the socials, X/Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Follow my Letterboxd account to see what I'm watching and what I'm reviewing. And then also be sure to check out Back to the Balcony with my co host, Justin Henson of The Movie Wire, who is a frequent collaborator of Dan here. That's every Tuesday. We are reaching our year long episode. So that's going to be fantastic. And then I think the last thing I got to say is by the time you hear this episode, you will have just recently heard Dan's visit on my show, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast, where we talk about British gangster films in a series that we call Brit Grit. We recorded that about a month ago, but it's finally coming out. I had to get through all the Halloween stuff, and we have a great conversation about British crime films.
I can't wait for that to come out. I've had so much fun talking to you about those. And yeah, again, so please do make sure you subscribe to all those. I just, again, want to back it up. Antonio and Justin, having been two of the podcasters I've actually had the real pleasure of meeting in real life.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, can honestly say that, yeah, two really good people. So yeah, please do show your support. So for me, you're listening, so you know where to get me. If you want to interact with me, social media, just look for Casting Views across all the social platforms. If there's an idea for an episode or you want to be on one of the episodes, let me know. Antonio, I think all that's left then is to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Dan. I'll see you later.
1, 2, 3, 4. If I want your opinion, I will give it to you. Come on, take what we've got, 'cause you need it. Don't make us get a spark and force feed.